Underground Railroad. Most of the people who belonged to it believed in both sorts of action, but however much they theoretically subscribed to the right of the majority to enact and enforce laws, they didn't believe in it on that point. My grandfather was a member of the Underground, many a fugitive slave he helped on his way to Canada. He was a very patient, law-abiding man in most respects, though I have often thought that he respected it because he didn't have much to do with it, always leading a pioneer life. Law was generally far from him, and direct action imperative. Be that as it may, and law-respecting as he was, he had no respect whatever for slave laws, no matter if made by 10 times of a majority, and he conscientiously broke every one that came in his way to be broken. There were times when in the operation of the Underground that violence was required, and was used. I recollect one old friend relating to me how she and her mother kept watch all night at the door, while a slave for whom a posse was searching hid in the cellar, and though they were of Quaker descent and sympathies, there was a shotgun on the table. Fortunately it did not have to be used that night. When the Fugitive Slave Law was passed with the help of the political actionists of the North who wanted to offer a new sop to the slaveholders, the direct actionists took to rescuing recaptured fugitives. There was the rescue of Shara, and the rescue of Jerry, the latter rescuer is being led by the famous Gerrit Smith, and a good many more successful and unsuccessful attempts. Still the politicals kept on pottering and trying to smooth things over, and the abolitionists were denounced and decried by the ultra-law-abiding pacificators, pretty much as William D. Haywood and Frank Bone are being denounced by their own party now. The other day I read the communication in the Chicago/Daily Socialist/ from the secretary of the Louisville Local Socialist Party to the national secretary, requesting that some safe and sane speaker be substituted for Bone, who had been announced to speak there. In explaining why, Mr. Dobbs makes this quotation from Bone's lecture: had the McNamaras been successful in defending the interests of the working class, they would have been right, just as John Brown would have been right, had he been successful in freeing the slaves. Ignorance was the only crime of John Brown, and ignorance was the only crime of the McNamaras. Upon this Mr. Dobbs comments as follows: we dispute emphatically the statements here made. The attempt to draw a parallel between the open-if mistaken, revolt of John Brown on the one hand, and the secret and murderous methods of the McNamaras on the other, is not only indicative of shallow reasoning, but highly mischievous in the logical conclusions which may be drawn from such statements. Evidently Mr. Dobbs is very ignorant of the life and work of John Brown. John Brown was a man of violence. He would have scorned anybody's attempt to make him out anything else. And once a person is a believer in violence, it is with him only a question of the most effective way of applying it, which can be determined only by a knowledge of conditions and means at his disposal. John Brown did not shrink at all from conspiratorial methods. Those who have read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass and the reminiscences of Lucy Coleman, will recall that one of the plans laid by John Brown was to organize a chain of armed camps in the mountains of West Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, send secret emissaries among the slaves inciting them to flee to these camps, and there concert such measures as times and conditions made possible for further arousing revolt among the Negroes. That this plan failed was due to the weakness of the desire for liberty among the slaves themselves, more than anything else. Later on, when the politicians in their infinite deviousness contrived a fresh proposition of how not to do it, known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which left the question of slavery to be determined by the settlers, the direct actionists on both sides sent bogus settlers into the territory, who proceeded to fight it out. The pro-slavery men, who got in first, made a constitution recognizing slavery and a law punishing with death anyone who aided the slave to escape, but the Free Soilers, who were a little longer in arriving since they came from more distant states, made a second constitution, and refused to recognize the other party's laws at all. And John Brown was there, mixing in all the violence, conspiratorial or open. He was a horse thief and a murderer, in the eyes of decent, peaceable, political actionists. And there is no doubt that he stole horses, sending no notice in advance of his intention to steal them, and that he killed pro-slavery men. He struck and got away a good many times before his final attempt on Harper's Ferry. If he did not use dynamite, it was because dynamite had not yet appeared as a practical weapon. He made a great many more intentional attacks on life than the two brothers Secretary Dobbs condemns for their murderous methods. And yet history has not failed to understand John Brown. Mankind knows that though he was a violent man, with human blood upon his hands, who was guilty of high treason and hanged for it, yet his soul was a great, strong, unselfish soul, unable to bear the frightful crime which kept 4 million people like dumb beasts, and thought that making war against it was a sacred, a God-called duty, for John Brown was a very religious man, a Presbyterian. It is by and because of the direct acts of the forerunners of social change, whether they be of peaceful or warlike nature, that the human conscience, the conscience of the mass, becomes aroused to the need for change. It would be very stupid to say that no good results are ever brought about by political action. Sometimes good things do come about that way. But never until individual rebellion, followed by mass rebellion, has forced it. Direct action is always the clamorer, the initiator, through which the great sum of indifferentists become aware that oppression is getting intolerable. We have now an oppression in the land, and not only in this land, but throughout all those parts of the world which enjoy the very mixed blessings of civilization. And just as in the question of chattel slavery, so this form of slavery has been begetting both direct action and political action. A certain percent of our population, probably a much smaller percent than politicians are in the habit of assigning at mass meetings, is producing the material wealth upon which all the rest of us live, just as it was 4 million chattel blacks who supported all the crowd of parasites above them. These are the land workers and the industrial workers. Through the unprophesied and unprophesiable operation of institutions which no individual of us created, but found in existence when he came here, these workers, the most absolutely necessary part of the whole social structure, without whose services none can either eat, or clothe, or shelter himself, are just the ones who get the least to eat, to wear, and to be housed withal, to say nothing of their share of the other social benefits which the rest of us are supposed to furnish, such as education and artistic gratification. These workers have, in one form or another, mutually joined their forces to see what betterment of their condition they could get, primarily by direct action, secondarily by political action. We have had the Grange, the Farmers' Alliance, cooperative associations, colonization experiments, Knights of Labor, trade unions, and industrial workers of the world. All of them have been organized for the purpose of wringing from the masters in the economic field a little better price, a little better conditions, a little shorter hours, or on the other hand to resist a reduction in price, worse conditions, or longer hours. None of them has attempted a final solution of the social war. None of them, except the industrial workers, has recognized that there is a social war, inevitable so long as present legal social conditions endure. They accepted property institutions as they found them. They were made up of average men, with average desires, and they undertook to do what appeared to them possible and very reasonable things. They were not committed to any particular political policy when they were organized, but were associated for direct action of their own initiation, either positive or defensive. Undoubtedly there were and are among all these organizations, members who looked beyond immediate demands, who did see that the continuous development of forces now in operation was bound to bring about conditions to which it is impossible that life continue to submit, and against which, therefore, it will protest, and violently protest, that it will have no choice but to do so, that it must do so or tamely die, and since it is not the nature of life to surrender without struggle, it will not tamely die. 22 years ago I met Farmers' Alliance people who said so, Knights of Labor who said so, trade unionists who said so. They wanted larger aims than those to which their organizations were looking, but they had to accept their fellow members as they were, and try to stir them to work for such things as it was possible to make them see. And what they could see was better prices, better wages, less dangerous or tyrannical conditions, shorter hours. At the stage of development when these movements were initiated, the land workers could not see that their struggle had anything to do with the struggle of those engaged in the manufacturing or transporting service, nor could these latter see that theirs had anything to do with the movement of the farmers. For that matter, very few of them see it yet. They have yet to learn that there is one common struggle against those who have appropriated the earth, the money, and the machines. Unfortunately, the great organizations of the farmers frittered itself away in a stupid chase after political power. It was quite successful in getting the power in certain states, but the courts pronounced its laws unconstitutional, and there was the burial hole of all its political conquests. Its original program was to build its own elevators, and store the products therein, holding these from the market till they could escape the speculator. Also, to organize labor exchanges, issuing credit notes upon products deposited for exchange. Had it adhered to this program of direct mutual aid, it would, to some extent, for a time at least, have afforded an illustration of how mankind may free itself from the parasitism of the bankers and the middlemen. Of course, it would have been overthrown in the end, unless it had so revolutionized men's minds by the example as to force the overthrow of the legal monopoly of land and money, but at least it would have served a great educational purpose. As it was, it went after the red herring and disintegrated merely from its futility. The Knights of Labor subsided into comparative insignificance, not because of failure to use direct action, nor because of its tampering with politics, which was small, but chiefly because it was a heterogeneous mass of workers who could not associate their efforts effectively. The trade unions grew strong as the Knights of Labor subsided, and have continued slowly but persistently to increase in power. It is true the increase has fluctuated, that there have been setbacks, that great single organizations have been formed and again dispersed. But on the whole, trade unions have been a growing power. They have been so because, poor as they are, they have been a means whereby a certain section of the workers have been able to bring their united force to bear directly upon their masters, and so get for themselves some portion of what they wanted, of what their conditions dictated to them they must try to get. The strike is their natural weapon, that which they themselves have forged. It is the direct blow of the strike which 9 times out of 10 the boss is afraid of. Of course there are occasions when he is glad of one, but that's unusual, and the reason he dreads a strike is not so much because he thinks he cannot win out against it, but simply and solely because he does not want an interruption of his business. The ordinary boss isn't in much dread of a class-conscious vote. There are plenty of shops where you can talk socialism or any other political program all day long, but if you begin to talk unionism you may forthwith expect to be discharged or at best warned to shut up. Why? Not because the boss is so wise as to know that political action is a swamp in which the workingman gets mired, or because he understands that political socialism is fast becoming a middle-class movement, not at all. He thinks socialism is a very bad thing, but it's a good way off. But he knows that if his shop is unionized, he will have trouble right away. His hands will be rebellious, he will be put to expense to improve his factory conditions, he will have to keep working men that he doesn't like, and in case of strike he may expect injury to his machinery or his buildings. It is often said, and parrot-like repeated, that the bosses are class-conscious, that they stick together for their class interest, and are willing to undergo any sort of personal loss rather than be false to those interests. It isn't so at all. The majority of business people are just like the majority of working men, they care a whole lot more about their individual loss or gain than about the gain or loss of their class. And it is his individual loss the boss sees, when threatened by a union. Now everybody knows that a strike of any size means violence. No matter what anyone's ethical preference for peace may be, he knows it will not be peaceful. If it's a telegraph strike, it means cutting wires and poles, and getting fake scabs in to spoil the instruments. If it is a steel rolling mill strike, it means beating up the scabs, breaking the windows, setting the gauges wrong, and ruining the expensive rollers together with tons and tons of material. If it's a miners' strike, it means destroying tracks and bridges, and blowing up mills. If it is a garment workers' strike, it means having an unaccountable fire, getting a